It's the end of an era in Sudan. One of the world's longest-serving heads of state, whose brutal rule over the country lasted for 30 years, was toppled after months of anti-government protests.
Turning now to big breaking news out of Sudan this morning.
State media have said the country's armed forces will be making, quote, an important announcement.
This out of Sudan. After 30 years in power, President Omar al-Bashir has been forced out of power by the country's military.
But the end of Omar Hassan al-Bashir's rule by a military coup wasn't enough to satisfy Sudanese protesters. Now, they're calling for the end of the entire regime that he built and that kept him in power for so long. To understand how this all unfolded, let's go back to December 19, 2018. Hundreds of demonstrators took to the streets of the northeastern city of Atbara and other cities across Sudan. They protested the country's economic decline under al-Bashir. Inflation had recently skyrocketed to nearly 70%, and the price of food had risen dramatically as well. Take bread prices. They rose 3 times the normal rate, making the staple increasingly unaffordable. That's why these protests were initially dubbed the bread riots. But while the price of bread might have been the initial catalyst for some of the unrest, some experts point out that it wasn't the only reason. The protests were largely a result of the broader dissatisfaction with the 75-year-old president's brutal rule, a rule that is older than the majority of the country's population. Nearly 2 out of 3 people there are under the age of 25, according to CIA estimates. The protests continue to grow, even making their way to the capital, Khartoum. In April, tens of thousands of anti-government protesters surrounded the army headquarters and made history. These protests became the longest sustained demonstrations in Sudan since it gained independence in 1956. The military started to violently crack down on the protesters. But things started to change when some Sudanese soldiers began protecting the anti-government protesters. This marked the beginning of what would become the end of al-Bashir's rule.
The Sudanese army has deployed troops around the defense ministry on key roads and bridges in the capital Khartoum. There are reports the head of the ruling party and the former vice president have been detained.
The military turned its back on al-Bashir, poetically ending his presidency in a coup, the same way he gained power in 1989.
عليه أعلن أنا وزير الدفاع رئيس اللجنة الأمنية العليا اقتلاع ذلك النظام والتحفظ على رأسه بعد اعتقاله في مكان آمن.
People celebrated in the streets of Khartoum. But those celebrations would be short-lived.
إذا ما تكونت حكومة مدنية بتمثل الشعب السوداني تمثيل حقيقي يبقى نحن ثورتنا ثورة منقوصة، ثورة ناقصة ما بتمثل آمال وأحلام الشعب السوداني. عشان كده نحن حنقول حنظل نضغط وحنظل قاعدين في الميدان لحد ما كل المطالب حقتنا المشروعة اطلعنا وتحالفنا من أجلها تتحقق.
The new military government headed by Defense Minister Awad ibn Auf was far from what the people demanded. The military's plan included suspending Sudan's constitution and said that Ibn Auf would become the country's leader for the next 2 years. Then the military would hand over control of the country after democratic elections were held. But UN human rights officials have insisted that the new military government listen to the demands for a quick transition to civilian rule.
We are calling on the authorities to address the people's demands, and whatever transition is taking place needs to take place with the meaningful participation of dissenting voices and of civil society.
The new military government also said it wouldn't extradite al-Bashir to the International Criminal Court, where he faces charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He's wanted by the ICC for his role in the Darfur genocide, which began in 2003. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed during that time. And there are likely reasons the new government refused to hand al-Bashir over. Some of the military officials swept into power after al-Bashir's fall have also been accused of grave human rights violations by the same court.
One of the reasons why the first takeover, which was announced on April 11th, was not received very well is because the head of it, the one who presented himself as the self-appointed leader, is actually someone who had been responsible for some very abusive military operations in Darfur and elsewhere, and was sanctioned himself by the United States in 2007. And the protesters were just not happy with this military solution. They said, look, we don't want more of the same.
So the protesters continued calling for a revolution in the streets of Khartoum, demanding new leadership.
يمثل الفترة الانتقالية القادمة. عايزين كيان جديد، مرحلة جديدة، عايزين إعمار بناء للبلد. الجماعة دي هسه حاليا ما عندهم أي خطة واضحة.
And just like that, in a matter of a day, the Sudanese people ousted yet another leader from office.
أعلن أنا رئيس المجلس العسكري الانتقالي التنازل عن هذا المنصب.
He handed power to this man, another military general, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who remains the country's leader, at least for now.
People have criticized that move also, but they feel that the second person is somehow easier to work with and will help facilitate the transition. So I'm not hearing from my sources as much anger about him personally, but I think that it is definitely true that the members of the military council include people who have blood on their hands. And most Sudanese people know that. And that is why they're so keen that power gets shifted to civilian leaders very quickly.
So far, al-Burhan has taken meaningful steps to satisfy the protesters, like lifting curfews placed on them by the previous leader and vowing to dismantle al-Bashir's regime. But that still isn't enough for those demanding change. So now, protesters and the military government remain in a stalemate. While the military continues to install high-ranking generals to lead the country forward, at least in the interim, the protesters remain very consistent with their demands. They seem willing to continue occupying the streets until a civilian government is in power in Sudan. These historic protests might have ended al-Bashir's decades-long rule, but is the country one step closer to a democratically elected civilian government? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching Now This World, and make sure to tune back next week for a brand new episode.